There's several things happening at once. I mean, part of this is based on transaction cost changes. The internet suddenly allows it much more easy to share information than before. So we've seen the influence this has had. This has enabled sharing of data between researchers. It's enabled the switch in access models for publications. It's started people to start thinking about whether this can go further into the translational domain. We're seeing open source software really having an impact on software industries across the world. Can you take this further into drug development? So I think that the issue there is that it is rather different from open source. Open source software, there aren't the experimental costs. You're just writing software, and people can do that in a distributed way relatively easy. In the case of drugs, you've got to recover those investments, those very expensive investments in the clinical developments and of course clinical trials. But there is now discussion about whether you can reward those costs in different ways rather than relying on marketing monopolies, which is the current structure. So there's two ways of changing this. One is to say the open models can actually organize information sufficiently well that you might be able to develop drugs collectively, directly between researchers. And that's what's being attempted relatively successfully so far by the public development partnerships that have been set up. They're directly funded by organizations like the Gates Foundation. If that's going to be sustainable, and it's a question of how well managed those entities are, but also where the money comes from, it's going to require financial change, and that's being discussed in the WHO right now. An intergovernmental working group there's just been approval of a global plan this May in the World Health Organization. The next phase of that is working out how the financing mechanisms are going to exist. There are various models for that. So that's direct side, but the other side is parts of the existing model, commercial entities developing drugs, but being rewarded directly rather than giving them marketing monopolies so that you can allow generic manufacture and rapid access to new medicines. And so those are kind of prize models. They still require the financing mechanisms, but ways of rewarding innovators immediately upon getting a drug approved. It doesn't actually change the patent model. Right now, you have a load of patents leading up to a product, you get an entity and you get it approved by the FDA in America. At that point, the FDA grants you a marketing monopoly, and there's legislation around that, for example, for orphan drugs, which makes different structures. The only change in this kind of model is saying, well, we don't give you a marketing monopoly, you're eligible to a charge on the prize fund, and in exchange, you have to give an open license, at which point anybody can manufacture this drug. You may be manufacturing it already yourself, but you've got to allow competition in manufacture. And that should result in very cheap costs. It allows people to innovate in how to produce this drug in new ways, which is exactly what happens currently, or has happened in India, where generic manufacture has been very efficient. So the issue is switching to having a prize fund so that you can reward the innovator. If you just make everything generic, there's no incentive for people to do the innovation. So you've got to, in parallel, reward the innovation directly. So here, the patent is really a signal that you're the one that's discovered it, that have done the work that led to the product. And of course, there may be a chain of patents in terms of what's led up to that. The prize is going to reward that. And the prizes, we're talking about very large prizes here. We're talking about maybe $1 billion over 10 years, which is basically meant is to cover the risk you took, the costs in developing the drug, and all the costs of the drugs that failed and on the process. It's really meant to be an equivalent, equivalent to what you would get out of the marketing monopoly. The major difference is because you've allowed immediate generic manufacture, a lot more people will be able to afford the drug. So it increases access while keeping the incentives for doing the development the same.